from the places, our God, where we met thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand true to our God, true to our native land, true to our God, true to our native land.
It's always good to start in song, and it's always good for me to start with that particular song. A song, in my view, that's both poem and history and prayer. It tells a portion of the story of what Black folk have been through in this country and what Black folk continue to strive for. So I've chosen as our topic today the theme of There is a River. And this theme, There is a River, comes from both our Bible, the Psalms, in which a passage says, "There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God." And it comes from this history textbook written by the late Professor Vincent Harding. Professor Harding wrote this textbook, A History of the African American Freedom Struggle, as a way of chronicling African American history. And I think this work, more so than any other work, helps to provide a celebratory look at Black history that doesn't fall into some of the usual pitfalls. And what I mean by this is that when discussing Black history, it can often be easy to fall into two temptations. One temptation is to think of Black history as merely a history of people suffering. A history of people suffering under systems of domination, under systems of violence. And although that's a very real part of the story, there's a temptation to view Black history as solely and only that. On the other hand, there's a temptation to view Black history as nothing more than a steady march of progress. That it begins with enslavement, and then it ends with freedom and the election of Barack Obama. Both of those dominant views of Black history, in my opinion, falls into a particular trap. A trap that sees either it's all a story of suffering or it's all a story of progress. And that, to me, is a very real limitation. And so instead of these triumphant or sort of simply despairing stories of Black history, a better way to examine it, I think, comes to us from Professor Vincent Harding. And in a moment, excuse me, I'll ask for a volunteer to read just a portion of the opening of this text for us. For those of you that do not know, Vincent Harding, one of my heroes, was a minister, an activist, and a historian. He wrote the first draft of Martin Luther King's sermon that he delivered on April 4th, 1967, in opposition to the Vietnam War. Vincent Harding was a close friend and advisor to Dr. King, and he was a pacifist. He was nonviolent. He was committed to ending wars and systems of domination. And so this work is an extension of his broader ministry and activism. And so he begins this story this way. I'm wondering if I could get a volunteer to read it. This work is an experiment in history, solidarity, and hope. Could someone read it? Raise your hand if you're willing. Okay, Tony, go ahead.
This work is an experiment in history, solidarity, and hope. It is part of a continuing attempt to discover and develop the source of creative tension among my responsibilities as a historian, my commitment to human liberation, and my urgent determination to keep faith with that magnificent company of witnesses, my mothers and fathers, whose lives form the wellspring of the Black struggle for freedom in America. Ultimately, what I have written is also meant as an offering to the children, all our children, who shall live and prevail. These pages are my encouragement to them, the expression of my hope that they may join their lives with all life in love and courage, daring to create and become much more than we ever dreamed was possible on these shores of darkness and light.
Keep going. Affirming objectivity and subjectivity.
Affirming objectivity and subjectivity as equally necessary to any compassionate rendering of our flawed and splendid human strivings. I have tried honestly to tell the story and to provide a rigorous analysis of the long Black movement towards justice, equity, and truth. Excuse me. At the same time, identifying fully with the subjects of my study and the substance of their hope, I have freely allowed myself to celebrate. For I could not possibly remain silent and unmoved in the presence of the mysterious, transformative dance of life that has produced the men and women, the ideas and institutions, the visions, betrayals, and heroic dreams renewed in blood that are once the anguish and the glory of the river of our struggle in this land.
Someone else pick up. Yet, if I understand the essence of what I've done. Yes, Mary Lambeth?
Can you hear me?
Yep, sure can.
Yet, if I understand the essence of what I have done, then beyond celebration and analysis, beyond narrative and documentation, there is still more. Somewhere near the heart of the work is a search for meaning, an attempt to apprehend and share with others my own tentative grasp of the harrowing and terrifying beauty of my people's pilgrimage in this strangely promised land. Why did it happen? Why were we chosen to be chosen if we were? How in the midst of such death and suffering could we find so much strength to love, so much determination to live, fight on, and be free? In permanent and grueling exile, how could a people dance and create songs and art, fashion institutions of hope, bear so many children of beauty? In the land of our captivity, subject to a host of attempts at dehumanization and humiliation, how and why did we become the nation's foremost champions of human freedom and social justice, creators of many of its most native rhythms of life? And what now is our future and this nation's destiny if those costly creative Black visions of hope, long nurtured in the fires of persecution, should be broken and bastardized or meanly forgotten in a ruthless and unprincipled process of Americanization?
Read the next paragraph and we'll wrap up in a bit.
Such a quest for meaning in history, such attempts to lift our eyes from the past toward the future, at times to venture beyond both past and future, are not often fashionable in the realms of academia, which is one reason why I have spent so much of my time on the blurred and questionable edges of its domain. Nevertheless, this kind of search is neither new nor unexpected in our human adventure, especially among the children of a captive people who have known what it is to live far from our native clime under the white man's menace, out of time, and who may once again sense some furtive but urgent call to rendezvous with the life-giving forces of the morning.
Good. Let's go down a little bit and we'll pick up. Someone read, perhaps of most importance to the ultimate content of the book. Larnell.
All right. Okay. All right. Perhaps of most importance to the ultimate content of the book was the decision that rose up like a powerful mandate from the experiences of the Southern Black struggle. It was now clear to me that a history of Black radicalism in the United States was too narrow, too abstract, too European a means of developing my subject. Far too constricted a way to keep the faith. Instead, I knew that what I wanted and needed to write about was something that had never been developed in one work. A narrative, analytical, and celebrative history of the freedom struggle of Black people in this country, beginning before there was a country.
Keep going. I was.
Okay. I was. Okay. Is it especially after that?
And especially.
Okay, right there. Okay. Especially concerned to try to convey its long, continuous movement. Hold on. Flowing like a river, sometimes powerful, tumultuous, and roiling. Is it rolling or
Roiling.
roiling with life? At other times, meandering and turgid, covered with the ice and snow of seemingly endless winters. All too often, streaked and running with blood.
Okay, let's stop here for now. This serves as the introduction to this textbook on the Black struggle for freedom. And what Vincent Harding is doing in this opening is he's trying to show us his view of Black history. And for him, Black history is a celebration, a story of struggle, and most importantly, it gives us insight for a new moral vision. When Vincent Harding critiques the limits of ordinary academia, what he's getting at is that according to the rules of history then, the historian was supposed to exhibit distance from their subject. You write about people as an observer. But what Vincent Harding raises for us is this question of how can I be an uninterested observer in a story that I've participated in? As we begin this, I told you that Vincent Harding was active in the civil rights movement, a friend and colleague of Dr. King, an activist on his own right. And so he begins this work by challenging the rules of history and the often Eurocentric parameters that we put on the production of knowledge. This is important for us to begin here, because a part of what Vincent Harding gives us insight to is that Black history isn't just American history in blackface. It's very important. That Black history isn't just a list of the first Black person to climb a mountain, the first Black person to drive a car, the first Black person to make it outer space. That's fine. Those lists are important. They're good at a particularly elementary level. When I go to my daughter's school events, they stand up there and the kids walk us through the litany of the Black folk that have done things first, and it's great for elementary school kids. But what Vincent Harding is probing us to do is to move beyond the elementary understanding of Black history into a realm that's more complex. And a part of what he's saying is that the entire intellectual structure of Black history, because the entire intellectual structure of Black folk has a different foundation. Let's pause here for a minute. If we go back to the song, Lift Every Voice and Sing, it ends with these words: true to our God, true to our native land. This song recognizes that a part of what makes Black folk Black in Black history unique and distinct from other forms of history, other ways of doing history, is its ties back to the African epistemological tradition. Okay. What is epistemology? Epistemology is how we know, how we produce and construct knowledge. René Descartes, several centuries ago, clearly articulated the European epistemological framework. He posed the question, this French philosopher, how do we know? By saying, I think, therefore I am. I know who I am and what I know because of my ability, my capacity to think. And this is the foundation upon which much of the Western world, including Western Europe and the United States, is built on. This idea that knowledge is tied to the purely rational. Stay with me. out of this is the idea that our humanity is tied to the rational. I think, therefore I am. This epistemological framework in which you begin with the rational, the outside of the brain, of the self, really, colored, so to speak, much of the way that Western Europeans engaged with other groups that they met. They judged them based upon their perception of their proximity to this idea that they were rational. We see this in the diaries of Christopher Columbus. Columbus tells us upon making his way to the Americas that the peoples that he's engaging with are non-rational. Therefore, in his view, it makes them perfect subjects, perfect people to be enslaved. We see this in the diaries and records that have been left by some of the earliest European missionaries and explorers of the African interior. Even some of the most profound European thinkers, such as George Wilhelm Hegel, have said that Africa, as a continent, lacks rationality. So for much of European and Western, read also white American, thought, there has been this idea that one's humanity was tied to their rational capabilities as decided upon by Europeans and their descendants. Do you follow? This is very important. This helped to lay the intellectual foundation for domination. Okay. The African epistemological foundation is found in a very simple phrase that I'm sure many of you have heard. Most commonly, it has been associated with the anti-apartheid freedom movement in South Africa and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a Bantu word. The Zulu people of South Africa, the Xhosa people of South Africa, and many of the other thousands of people groups in sub-Saharan Africa are products of a human migration known as the Bantu migration. And for several thousand years, beginning in both East and West Africa, below the Sahara, there was a movement of people along the primary river valleys of the African interior, which served as the foundational linguistic and cultural group of most Africans. So many African languages spoken today have their root in this Bantu linguistic and cultural reality. So the concept of Ubuntu, which we find in what is today South Africa, popularized by Desmond Tutu, is an idea that's shared across the African continent. We need to put an addendum here. It's not to say that African people are exactly the same in all parts of the continent. No, but it's to say that there are some shared realities that African peoples have. There are some common connections, similarities, and ideas. And this phrase, Ubuntu, says, I am because we are. How do you know you're human? It's not tied to the rational, although that's important. It's tied to the communal. I am because we are. I know I'm human because I'm connected to y'all. You know you're human because you're connected to us. We know we're human because we're connected to each other. This serves as the epistemological foundation for Africans. And in my view, when Africans are tied up in the Atlantic slave trade, when they make their way to the Americas, a part of what they bring with them, a part of what enslavement can't take from them, is this fundamental way of knowing and being. I am because we are. This is important to establish the idea that what makes Black history, in my view, distinct, significant, and compelling is this realization that the human experience cannot be bifurcated into the rational and the bodily. Rather, to put it differently, a part of the contribution that I think Africans, read Black folks, make to the world is they put their hands in the air and say, wait a second, can we separate our minds from our bodies? This is what Vincent Harding is getting at in this text. It's a critique of history, but it's not just a critique of history. It's a critique of our overall society and the emphasis and values that we make in our overall society. This is a work in history, solidarity, and hope. In short, Vincent Harding is saying to us that a part of what Black history is doing is it's seeking not just to tell us information, but to transform us. Not just to tell us information, but to transform us. I want to open it up to questions in a moment, but I want to keep reading just a bit. This is what Professor Harding said. He keeps writing. At first, the river metaphor took life within me. I was unduly concerned about its apparent inexactness and ambiguity. Now, with the passing of time and the deepening of our vision, it's possible to recognize that we are indeed the river And at the same time, that river is more than us, generations more than us, millions more than us. Through such an opening, we may sense that the river of Black struggle is people, but it is also the hope, the movement, the transformative power that humans create and that create them, us, and it makes them, us, new persons. So watch this. So we Black folk are the river. The river is in us. The river is us. The river is in us, created by us, flowing out of us, surrounding us, and recreating this entire nation. I refer to the American nation without hesitation because the Black river in the United States has always taken on more than Blackness. The dynamics and justice of its movement have continually gathered others to itself, have persistently filled other people with the force of its vision, its indomitable hope. And at its best, the river of our struggle has moved consistently towards the ocean of humankind's most courageous hopes for freedom and integrity. Forever seeking what Black folk in South Carolina in 1865 said was the right to develop their whole being. A part of why we're here, starting here, is to try to have a different relationship to the concept of Black history. Black history is not, wow, Black people can read too. Black people can be citizens too. Black people can be doctors too. Black people can be preachers too. Black history is what does the study, the broad, comprehensive, and complex study of Black folk have to offer us, to teach us about the world and its fundamental truths, about our societies and its fundamental contradictions, about our God and their infinite love, about ourselves and our own possibilities. This is very important. A part of why this is important, look, fortunately, where I'm at right now, at this particular moment in time, I am in a part of the country in which, generally speaking, the value of Black history is understood. But if I were to get in my car and drive about 30 minutes out across the Potomac River and go into Northern Virginia, I would enter a part of the country in which there is this idea that Black history poses a fundamental threat to the American society. If I were to keep driving and go to North Carolina, keep driving and go to Florida, if I was to go to my home state of Louisiana, I would have to confront this idea that a generation of children are being taught that Black history is something that they need to be afraid of. Okay, well, what's the fear? Is it because Black history, in many instances, offers a critique of the American society? Absolutely. Absolutely, it does. Why shouldn't it? Why should the stories of people enslaved not critique the slaveholding society? So there's this idea in much of the country that Black history shouldn't be taught because it makes white folk uncomfortable. Okay, we got to deal with that. What's so uncomfortable? Again, we live in the consequence, in the reality of the making of the modern world. How did we all come to be in community and connection with one another? This is a product of history. Not a history that any of us made, but a history that we have inherited. Vincent Harding is doing all this work to try to say to us that if we actually had a different approach to our study of Black history, to our engagement with Black history, it would bring a whole new set of questions, not just for our intellectual lives, but for our political lives, for our social lives. And this is where I said, don't forget, Vincent Harding is a preacher for our spiritual lives. The river is us. A lot of folk got a lot of problems with this idea that we can draw particular attention to Black folk. But Black people as a collective group of people exist in part because particular attention was drawn to their phenotype. And this was a necessary part of the wealth and nation building of the American and other Western states. Ta-Nehisi Coates reminds us in Between the World and Me that racism is the child of race, that race was constructed during the Atlantic slave trade around two poles, white and Black, for the purposes of facilitating the Atlantic slave trade. And so many groups of Africans spread out across the Americas were called and categorized into this collective of being Black. But this is the story of the external imposition. The internal response to that is that those people made themselves a people and fashioned out, as Vincent Harding said, one of the greatest traditions of liberation, of freedom. That is precisely that predicament, that historical reality in which these folk find themselves backed up against a corner, that the instinct is to create some new possibilities. So when Vincent Harding says that we are the river, What he's saying is that a part of the history of Black folk is that they're tapping into a tradition, into an ethos, into a theology to help them deal with their conditions. That's the river that he's referring to. That's the ethereal. You see, we have to sort of think about this. Africans and their descendants had a theology before they arrived to the Americas. I mean, you think about one of the favorite hymns that I like, that I'm sure if I go to any one of your churches, I'll hear at a funeral, Amazing Grace. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. You got to hear Aretha Franklin sing it. 15 minutes, 1 minute long, just on the A. But if you go to the hymnal, you look up the song, it says words by John Newton. The hymn and tune unknown. Part of the reason it's unknown is because more than likely John Newton hears these tunes while he's captain of a slave ship. And below the deck, the tune is coming out. Representative of a theology. Before I be a slave, I be buried in my grave to go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave to go home to my Lord and be free. A theology hidden, what Al Rabato tells us is the invisible institution, that these enslaved folk didn't write down all of their theology, but they compiled them in the form of the spirituals. They said, wait a second, how is an enslaved person saying, before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave? Wait a second, you're already enslaved. They're saying, I reject the imposition of this category, because in my heart, in my mind, in my body, in my soul, I know I'm not a slave. Had a theology. I'll fly away, oh glory, I'll fly away. When I die, hallelujah, by and by, I'll fly away. A song created not by Alison Krauss, as much as I like her version of it, created by enslaved Africans, representative of their theology. What do they think? Well, from the WPA slave narratives, we know that there was the idea of the flying Africans. That some enslaved folks said they would look up one day and see people leave the plantation and fly straight back to Africa. And what they were talking about was a particular group of people who believed that if they committed suicide, the body would not remain in the foreign land. The body would fly back home. That because of the African epistemology, that the body would not rest until it's made its way back to its own soil. So embedded in the song, I'll Fly Away, is a theology of resurrection. And it's a hidden meaning that their holders, their enslavers, could not always make sense of. So this is a part of what Vincent Harding is saying, is to really understand the conditions of the society and the experiences of those folks that live through the society. Gives us deep moral, theological, and spiritual insight that could benefit all of us. I want to open it up. I don't want to monopolize all of the time, but I just want to say this. This is the part that we often miss. there's insight, possibilities that could benefit all of us. At its best, emphasis at its best, not saying perfectly, not saying all Black folk, not saying every Black person. We're talking about a collective understanding of a history. At its best, the river of our struggle has moved consistently towards the ocean of humankind's most courageous hopes for freedom and integrity. What he's saying is we don't have to be worried if we're not directly tied to this specific history, because the insights learned from these people can still be applicable to all of humanity. This, in my view, is the great wisdom of Black history, is the great inspiration of Black history, is the great theology at the heart of how Vincent Harding is doing this Black history. Is he saying that really, when we look at it from this angle, it's a story about freedom. A very material story about freedom. And this story about freedom can encompass all of us. But we don't get there easily. We don't get there just by saying, okay, good, I like this story, I'm adopted. Nah, we get there by excavating our roots, dealing with the past. What's our connection? What's our lineage? And it doesn't mean that we're beholden to the past. It doesn't mean that we're stuck there. But it does mean that we got to deal with it. We got to acknowledge it. This is why, in my capacity as the co-director of the Alliance of Baptists, I can't stay in here in this role and not recognize our ties to the Southern Baptist Convention. I want to do something different. I presume y'all want to do something different, but we cannot do something different if we do not excavate our roots. That we got deep roots in the American slavocracy. This is a part of the insight that Vincent Harding brings. Now, wait a second, we got to deal with our origins, not just our 1987 origins, although we got to deal with that too. We got to deal with our 1845 origins. The Baptists splitting over the idea that humans ought to be kept in bondage. That's the advent of the Southern Baptist Convention. We cannot avoid that. We have to deal with our origins, our 1776 origins, in which Thomas Jefferson, George Washington look around in a room and say, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, but not those who work for me at Monticello and Mount Vernon. We can't do something new without acknowledging that. Without acknowledging that the American empire today is tied to the American slavocracy. We got to deal with our 1619 origins. That the project, as the historian Annette Gordon Reed says of Virginia, starts off as a money-making entity by any means necessary. We got to deal with our origins in the 15th century. That the mixing of the continents, the mixing of the people, the acquisition of the Americas by force and by theft and by violence is provided sacred theological canopy. And again, it doesn't mean that we can't do nothing new. We can do nothing new, but what we do that's new has to be cognizant of these origins, cognizant of this past. And so at its heart, in my view, what Black history offers us is a fundamental insight into the true nature, essence, and history of our shared society. It's not just for Black folk. It's for all of us. And it's in part to tell all of us as best we can, this is how the story was made. And it doesn't mean we can't make a new story. In fact, it is my view that we ought to make a new story, that we ought to do something new in light of what we hear. This is why Vincent Harding says this is a work of history, hope, solidarity. It's an experiment. He's trying to say, can we provoke something? Can studying Black history change us? Change our churches, change our communities, change our families, change ourselves. Stop there for now. Let's take about 30 or so minutes and do some question and answering. There's a lot more that we can say, but I wanted to offer this sort of broad overview for our discussion today. Addie, you have some questions?
I don't have any questions, but I do want to say that I've heard a lot of the lectures on this subject, and this is the overview. I hate to really get into the full curriculum class that you teach. It's been awesome thus far.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those kind words. Are there questions or things that you would like me to explain or say a bit more about? Anne, sure. You're on mute, Anne.
Sorry, goes back to the beginning when you said you're aiming for churches to become anti-racist. What does it mean to be an anti-racist church? We can feel like we have things happening in our church, but how do we step up, like welcoming and affirming? How do you become an anti-racist church?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I really think being an anti-racist church isn't a destination. It's a way of being.
Mm-hmm.
This is why I think this river imagery is so powerful. That the river flows. And really, the river doesn't end. The river, I'm thinking about the Mississippi River. I grew up on the banks of the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River flows into the Gulf of Mexico, which flows into the Caribbean, which flows into the Atlantic, which connects to the Pacific and the Indian, right? And so part of the idea is, I think, being an anti-racist church is having an orientation, right? That is committed to sort of saying we're on a journey and we're going to follow the journey where it takes us. Part of that, though, is a recognition of our origins. How did the story begin? Both the particular stories of the congregation, of the community, more broadly, if it needs to be, of the city, of the state, of the country. What was our role in that? And what we would like our role to be. I think holding those two questions in tension. If we're sort of proud of our role, all right, well, how do we continue to build on this legacy, on this tradition? How do we continue to follow the flow of the river? If there were some parts that weren't so great about that story, can we acknowledge it? Can we talk about it? I mean, when I was on the pastoral staff at Calvary Baptist Church, we learned through the work of one of our members that our church was paid for in part by a person who held slaves at one point in his life. And by the time he had laid the foundation of our church, it had probably been 30 years removed since he was a slaveholder. But I couldn't help but think about how holding enslaved people gave him some financial freedom, some financial flexibility, that later in life, he was able to do what he did. One Sunday morning, instead of having church, the pastoral team decided, look, we just need to talk about this. We need to sit down and tell this story. Because we can't be an anti-racist church if we don't acknowledge our origins, our connections. So there's some of that. I see that there are other hands, but I want to put another level to it. In addition to acknowledging our origins and recognizing the structures of institutional racism, of white supremacy in our society, we need to have an expansive intersectional lens. Because white supremacy didn't just produce anti-Black institutions and didn't just produce anti-Black sentiments just for the sake of being anti-Black. That a part of the challenge of being an anti-racist, like for real, is that anti-racism takes us to anti-imperialism. That anti-racism takes us to critiquing all the structures of domination, of empire. Because when you really see things from the perspective of those folk caught up in the bottom of the making of the modern world, I think it's a recognition that a lot of these pieces are tied together. And so anti-racism, I think, begins with, rightly so, with this acknowledgement, like, wow, like there's a history of racism in this country. But the history of racism in this country cannot be divorced from imperialism, from militarism, from capitalism. And so it's a tall order for churches. But I think it's about beginning. It's about getting in the water, and it's about following the river as best you can, because all of these points, I think, are points along the river. So I hope that helps some. And I'll try not to be so long-winded. Allison.
Well, I'm grateful for what you just said in the middle, when you were countering Descartes and when you were talking about the need to not separate the mind from the body. Of course, in my mind, all the feminist studies that I've done, that really was the experience of women being embodied people in a way that separated them, made them close to the earth, made them less human. And of course that got me thinking of the ways in which different types of oppression can mirror each other in some ways, but certainly the experience of a Black person in the United States is a very different embodied experience than a white woman, right? So I guess naming the intersections, but also, when you enter into the river of being racist, is that a different river than challenging patriarchy? Is that a different river? And I mean, and in some ways they're all flowing into this ocean of liberation, right? But there are these different, are there these different rivers? And those are some thoughts that I wanted to hear your response to. No real question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really excellent observation, and it's a really good question. You know, there are, you know, there are a lot of conversations that emerge when you talk about Black folk, right? If you sort of do what I just did, right? You sort of hold up Black folk as a collective, right? As a moral example. There's a danger in this because, you know, Black folk are people, and because we are people, there are all of these contradictions, all of these limitations, all of these examples of us also not living at our best, right? And so the danger in sort of holding up Black folk as a collective, right, is perhaps that we can't live up to that, right? So to sort of avoid that, I think the sort of the best thing to do is to look at the Black liberating tradition, right? What sort of made this collective history, not the individual, right? Because individuals always have limitations, but this collective history, what from that is insightful for us. And I think when we do that, I think when we look at Black history as a collective, I think what we gather from that is, yeah, I think it's fundamentally anti-patriarchal. I mean, a part of this goes back to the Africanity. There's a very good book. It's a bit complex, but there's a very good book on my desk right now called The Invention of Women, The Making of an African Sense of Western Gender Discourse by Oyeronke Oyewumi, in which she looks at Yoruba society in the pre-colonial era, the Yoruba people of Nigeria. And she says, you know, and other scholars critiqued her for this, but I think she makes a very compelling point. She says, you know, Yoruba society was not like our society and based upon a gendered hierarchy. That to the extent that the Yoruba today and Yoruba society and other African societies are patriarchal, this is a post-colonial creation. Ife Amadiomi says a similar thing about the Igbo people in her book, Male Daughters, Female Husbands. That when we look at a variety of African societies, we see that they were not all patriarchal, that some of them were matriarchal, some of them were matrilineal, meaning that you traced your ancestry not from your daddy, you couldn't trust your daddy, but from your mama, because we know you come from her. So the idea was that we'll organize our society around what we can trust versus what we can't. I mean, look, you could be, you say you are. We take your word for it, but there's more heft. We know you come from your mama. We saw it happen. And so I think that to the extent that some of those values made their way into the Americas, I think historically, the Black freedom struggle at its best was anti-patriarchy. But are there limitations? Were there Black leaders who were patriarchal, who reinforced certain aspects of patriarchy? Absolutely. But I think a part of the emphasis on the communal was that it sought to sort of limit the worst of our human instincts. And so in my view, it is also a anti-patriarchal river, and it's an intersectional river because included in Black history are all types of other people, Black women, Black queer folk, Black folk who are vulnerable because of their abilities or lack thereof. Later, when we get to the era of the citizenship time, Black folk who lack citizenship. I think it's a very, very good question. Are there others? Are there other thoughts?
Go ahead, Flora.
It seems to me that an anti-racist church is a church that cooperates with other churches, black and white, that are mainly black and white, to address very real problems like homelessness. And I think we need to remind ourselves that we are each free to vote, but we know that there's problems in people being discouraged to vote, but the people, and that's black, white, Asian, all other minorities. In fact, before long, there will be no minority. The white people will be a minority. We will not be over 50%. So that, but we free to correct the problems of of injustice, of our economic injustice is the biggest problem, I think, that we have. And so the church is responsible for, because we the people are responsible for our government. We are responsible for having a government, that everybody has equal rights, and especially our children, the little ones, they have every right to, and it is our responsibility to provide them with all that is necessary for them to become all that they are, all that they can be.
Yeah, so I really appreciate what you're saying, because I think that you're right, that we already have some avenues, some forays into anti-racism, based upon how many of our churches function, right? That, we all care about homelessness, right? We all care about people not having enough to eat. I'm sure we care about
poor schools.
Exactly, right?
It's wrong for in our Black communities for them. It is sinful and wrong and should not be tolerated that richer or off neighborhoods have good schools and the poor people none.
Well, this is good. So what these recognitions, I think, should push us to deal with, right, is to ask some deeper questions. Why are there so many homeless people or people who are unhoused? Is it because people have made bad choices? Or do we have a structure that
it's the structure
so much, right, that exploits so much and takes so much that there are so few resources? Well, this question isn't divorced and devoid of this history of white supremacy. And in part, hold on, Flora, let me finish this thought. In part, this is tied to the fact that the entire beginnings of our country is a beginning with exploitation, with excess.
It
with
was the
all
love
the
of
people.
money. It was the love of money, just like it is the love of money today.
Right. So which
And
is
what we have now, our structure now today is capitalism, pure capitalism for the poor, and welfare for the rich. I just study the
right. I agree with you.
yeah.
I agree with you.
Well, hush with that.
No, I agree with you. I think that's a profound insight. And I think a part of what that insight offers us is, how did we get here? We didn't get here accidentally. And I guess if you're maybe I haven't said this yet. Perhaps this is it. Look, every church, every person, every Christian, every however you describe yourself will have to sort of make their own choices on what their relationship will be to liberation, to transformation. My point is that whatever we seek to do should be informed as best we can by an appropriate rendering of history. And then when we ask the question, how did we get here? What we'll come back to see is that our modern world, our Western world, our American society, our country is tied back to this history. And this is why Black history, I think, has the power to transform us, because it asks the question, is this really what you want for the future? You know, I spend a lot of time talking to college students, and college students love to use the example that it's just human nature to be dominating. It's just human nature to be greedy. It's just human nature to be violent. And my consistent question to them is, are you sure that's human nature, or is that a particular rendering of history? Because I don't know.
God's image, and God's image is, in spite of all the, a lot of image of him is violent. That is not true. We're made in God's image, and we're good and not violent.
Yeah, well, and I think in my reading, I think this collective study of Black history tries to offer that insight. And as people in churches consider their anti-racist commitments, I think it's a recognition that we got to deal with the origins and then follow the river. But the insight there is that you can't always control where the river will take you. That if you follow the river, you gotta be serious about following the river. Okay, look, so I'm a historian and a teacher, but I'm also a Baptist preacher. And I think about my favorite hymn growing up, I have decided to follow Jesus. And that line, no turning back, no turning back. The world behind me, the cross before me. That, to put it differently, that to get in that river, it's to be open to say, well, the river is taking you some places. We have room for maybe one more question. Larnell?
Yeah. So what do you think the church can do in terms of like with the anti-racism to acknowledge some of the things that the church has done to be complicit into the racism as well as the separation, throughout its history, as well as the good that the church has done, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, again, I don't think, I mean, it's hard, right? Because but I really feel, and forgive it if it sounds like blasphemy, but I really feel like one of the challenges that we have as being followers, at least with the tradition that I'm in as a Baptist, as an Alliance of Baptist member, as a follower of Jesus. I feel like one of the challenges, but I also live in the contemporary 21st century United States. One of the challenges of that is that we want a easy fix, right? I'm not saying this is what you're asking, but this is what the question brings up for me right now. We want an easy fix, a quick fix, a 3 points, a 10 points, how do we do this quickly? And I think one of the insights that we get both from the Black freedom tradition and also from the teachings of Jesus, I think back to when, I guess it was that lawyer that asked Jesus in the text, well, what do I do to have eternal life? And Jesus was like, well, follow the law and follow the prophets. And he's like, what? I do all of that. And then Jesus says, go sell all of your things. And then the guy goes away sad, right? And I think there have been a lot of interpretations of that, but I think a part of why Jesus responds that way is because I think Jesus is like, you want an easy fix and you think you did it already. You think you can do it in one fall swoop. And Jesus like, okay, I got something for you. Go do this. Oh, it's not so easy. And I think what Jesus is really saying is that it's a lifetime commitment. That it's not something you just do. You don't flip on a switch, but that you say, I'm really committed to following this river. And so this is my first sort of thought, is that I think we got to really be discerning about what it means to want to follow this river. Now, with that said, I think a major thing that we can do is address our origins, address the types of ministries that we do. Are your ministries, are they supporting the work of anti-racism? Are you supporting the organizing that's happening in your community? Whether it's workers, immigrants. Are you a part of contemporary movements for justice? Are you standing in solidarity with the Palestinians? These are steps. Are you asking theologically, how are we breaking down our understanding of God from this perspective? I think one of the easiest things that historically white churches can do, are you supporting Black intellectual creatives and artists? These people need platforms, need spaces to live out their ideas, to share their ideas, to dream. Are you allowing your pulpit, your church, to be a free space intellectually, spiritually, artistically? There are a lot of options. And I'm still Baptist. And so my belief is that I can't tell you what y'all should do, but that you got to discern. You got to get together and discern where the Spirit is moving you. And I'm serious about that, right? And I think part of it is that it is in, I think, the discernment, the real grappling, the real reading, the real studying, the real slow process that says, wait a second, what does this mean? I think that will maybe reveal some of the truth that is before us. I think back to this piece, and I appreciate all of the questions and the conversations and for you all taking this time to be with us. I think that if there's one thing that I want to leave you all with, is that the insight from this liberating tradition of Black history is that transformation is possible, but it's not going to be quick or easy, or even within the contours of this existing structure. And that this is the wisdom that I think they have to offer. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. That before I be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave to go home to my Lord and be free. That freedom is possible. They, in fact, show us that. That is what makes them the river. And that this conception, this imagination, this vision, this what Robin D.G. Kelley calls freedom dream, has the power to surround us and recreate this entire nation, because at its best, this tradition has been concerned with more than itself, flowing into the ocean of humankind. And so it's okay to go slow. It's okay to take time to understand, but you got to actually take time to understand. And you got to follow the river. No turning back. No turning back. Can I say a word of prayer for us before we go? Gracious God, I just give thanks for this amazing day, this amazing month, this amazing opportunity to get to reflect on just some of the insights that the study of Black history can provide. God, I pray for each and every person here, that you might bless them, that you might keep them, that you might hold them, and that you might continue to work with us as we seek to do your transforming and liberating work in this world. For our brothers and sisters and siblings and friends who are struggling for justice and freedom in the many pockets of the globe, especially those in Palestine and the Congo and Sudan and us elsewhere, oh God, we pray that you be with them and that you send your spirit to comfort them. For this and for the meditations deep in our heart, God, we pray. Amen. Thank you all for being here. We hope to see more of you soon, and I hope you have a good and blessed rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Wow.
Thank you.